We're telling a student that film is like paper. It can be used for anything. And the medium has got so many purposes, so many uses, that you can do anything with it. One of the things you can do is the entertainment industry. You can use it as a personal means of self-expression in the most abstract and personal individual form, which many of the film artists at the Institute here are really doing. They're thinking of film the way a painter thinks of canvas and paint. And they are not overtly conscious of who their audience is going to be. They're thinking of it purely as self-expression. But then you can use film for political or social polemic. You can use it in a documentary sense for education. You can use it for medical research. You can use it for anything. And what we say is that there is a language of the image, which you might call film, but it's the grammar of sound and the moving picture that can be used for an infinite number of purposes. And we train you in the language. What you do with it is your problem.
This is a letter that Sandy gave to me in response to some work that I had provided to him. Dear John, I have a real problem with you. That you have some facility as a writer is very clear. What I don't understand is why you have come to a film school. Your literary facility is your chief handicap in writing for the screen. Accordingly, I am going to be ruthless. I am going to insist that you kill your babies, as the writer's slogan goes. I will absolutely refuse to accept from you the kind of writing in which descriptive charm is indulged, in order to evade the much harder task of putting on paper only what can be seen or heard. What is concrete, specific. This will be a kind of castration for you, I realize, but I know of no other way to force you to confront a fundamental difference between writing that is meant to be read and the task of thinking in movie terms. Similarly, it is a first step in the direction of forcing yourself to invent dramatic action as distinct from literary reflections. This was my chief problem in that period, and it's why he, I'll say reduced, but I mean that in the sense of like a mathematical reduction to the lowest principle, is he got me to the point of writing images almost exclusively, that I wouldn't write stories for him anymore. I would just write things that were happening. They were crap, a lot of them, but it was a totally different approach to thinking, and it profoundly affected everything that I have written since then.
I went to CalArts on a Hartnett Fellowship in 1978, and I came from Oxford. I'd just done a degree in English, and at that time, I think all my values were intellectual and verbal. Although I wanted to be a filmmaker, my abilities were verbal, and those were my inclinations. And I arrived at CalArts, and people were very nice to me, and I was sort of a stranger, and there weren't many, there was one other English person there or something. But people would stop and screech to a halt and say, geez, do you really speak like that? Because I would use words of more than 2 syllables. And nobody did. They didn't say. They used to say, wow, man, and that was it. And I have to say that I looked at them with a degree of contempt. My first term, I really found the people pretty dreary. But then I started to look at their work. And okay, they had 3 words. But when they translated their words into pictures, they were very good. Some of them were very talented, and I realized they were doing what I wanted to do. They were using pictures to express ideas. And Sandy was very clear about this, obviously, and interestingly enough, I got to know later that he had been not entirely in favour of my being given a place, because I was coming from this very verbal background. And Sandy was right. He was clear that just because you were intellectual and came from a strongly intellectual background, that could be a hindrance. You could waste a lot of time. I realized, fortunately quite quickly, and partly through Sandy's teaching, that however many wonderful words you had, if your film didn't show them, there was no point having the words. You're not coming to CalArts to carry on being a scholar at Oxford. You're coming to CalArts because you want to make film. So you've got to start again. You've got to think picture. And that's quite difficult if you've been trained in words, because intellect and intellectual ambition has always been dressed in words. Words have been what you've aimed for. Film is not like that. Film is not dressed in words. Film is dressed in pictures. And therefore, you are striving against your own education when you come to make film.
There is a tendency of critics and aficionados of movies and stuff to call things visual when what they really mean it's pictorial. And there's a difference between visual and pictorial in Sandy's definitions. Pictorial for Sandy is pretty pictures. And lots of people can get pretty pictures. Pretty pictures are the thing that Hollywood can do the easiest. But visual means telling the story with the pictures. And that separates the men from the boys.
A recurring theme of all my notes to students is that cinema is not so much non-verbal as pre-verbal. Though it is able to reproduce reams of dialogue, film can also tell stories purely in movement, in action and reaction. Cinematographic images, particularly when synchronized with recorded sound, deliver such quantities of visual and audible data that the verbal component is overwhelmed and becomes secondary. Look at this example, taken from André Caillet's 1949 film Les Amants de Vérone, as written by Jacques Prévert.
La chose est faite. Il vous plaisait? Il est à vous.
The entire incident is quick and casual. It probably takes less time in front of the camera than it does to explain in words. This is the point. It is not the sort of incident a novelist would invent because it is far clumsier to describe than to play out on film. Nor would it make a good piece of action for the stage actor, because the effect depends on quick glimpses of detail, the flicker of reactions on faces, and a switch of viewpoint by the camera. Prévert is writing for the cinema and nothing else.
For me, as going to be a documentary filmmaker, working in wildlife, this idea that you could tell your story in pictures and gestures. Go back to Sandy. If you think of your animals as characters in a story and you try to tell their story with pictures rather than with words, you have to use the same sort of grammar as you use with any other film. So a good grounding in grammar is extremely helpful. We're not just talking about cutaways and close-ups, we're really talking about the structured relationship between the animals, eye lines, axis, the visual relationship of where two animals are.
What you do when you do a play, and I've only done my own plays, is you look at a scene and think, there's too much talk. You have to get rid of the talk. So you see what's absolutely essential to the argument or to the emotion or whatever, and then you have to say to yourself, what is the important visual of this scene? Are they locked in a room together? Are they in an open field? Are they on a boat? Whatever. And you may have to find solutions that are visual solutions to make the scene work as a cinema scene. So the result is that when you're adapting, language takes second place to the pictorial image.
Sandy stressed that film should have cinematic or visual integrity, that you should be able to understand a good film even if you don't understand 80% of the dialogue, even if 80% of the dialogue is in a foreign language, he used to say.
I had a marvellous introduction, training as a director, because I stood at the elbow of Basil Dearden. He, on a set plan, said, I want a shot from here. And I said, well, if you get it from here, this has been the background. Do you want it like this? And do a thumbnail. And he said, no, bigger or farther away or whatever. And, I want it to pan over here. And I did this very, very rapidly in little sketches. Then went away and did, I think, about 1,000 pen and ink drawings, which helped them on the set.
I used my skill as an illustrator in doing sit-up sketches to parlay myself into the director's chair, really. And I've always done drawing, which is my equivalent of writing, really, because I think in terms of images. But once I've done the drawings, I hardly ever keep to them, because I regard them really as my rehearsals. And the great sort of fallacy is the idea that careful pre-planning like that in some way ties you down. It doesn't, it frees you.
I was employed to write the screenplay of A High Wind in Jamaica. MACKENDRICK was already on board as director. If he didn't think I described what he wanted to see properly, he drew it for me. He was a very, very good sketch artist, like a storyboard artist. But I do remember one sequence in particular, which was the entrance of Anthony Quinn onto the boat that the children are on. And he wanted him to appear above the gun railing. And he drew a series of, as it were, stills of this head appearing above the boat rail. And I just described that. And then he cut the description down to its barest minimum. He said, you don't need that, you don't need that. I don't know if it was a speech impediment, but he couldn't get words out. And he'd say, you see, I want to see more of the... I don't know what he was talking about. I was very young. I mean, I was very inexperienced. And thrilled to be in his presence, too. I was slightly in awe of him. And then he'd say, you know, the gun, and, you know, at the front of the ship should be turned up. He had all these curious, unfinished sentences. And then he'd go to a piece of paper and draw the figurehead on the ship, which was a woman. And then they see it turned upside down. The pirates think it's terrible bad luck, etc., etc. And he'd draw arrows of how it would turn. He had this precise technical mind.
When Sandy found that he couldn't put over to whoever he was talking to exactly what he wanted, he would get more and more frustrated until he got a pencil and a piece of paper and was able to illustrate what he was after, which was often more easily understood by his colleagues than his verbal description. And certainly at times he would then draw on the margins of the script very rough pictures of the framing or the movement, no details, just where the figure was in the frame and where the movement was.
His drawing was always so precise and extremely imaginative, because he could imagine what a setup would be from a tower, shall we say, 26 feet up. He would do a sort of perspective drawing from this imagined position, which was quite extraordinary. Actually, much later, when the tower had been built and we put a camera up there, it was quite remarkable to suddenly find exactly the same picture reproduced through the camera that he had drawn. His sense of the value of an image was so great, and also the importance of the image in relation to the story was something in which I think he had no equal.
It was a necessary skill for anybody who wanted to become a director to at least be able to make a properly proportioned stick figure of the actor in the frame in order to discuss with the camera person, with the other crew members, what he wanted to achieve, and to enhance his conceptualizing of what the scene was going to look like and how it would play out. If a person cannot draw effectively enough that you can tell whether it's a close-up or a medium shot, this is a communication problem.
He would say, on every given lens, you'll have to know how far from the camera the whole human body, like say 6 feet, will be from toe to head in the frame. So because when you are, I guess when he was writing his shooting script, he was already anticipating what lenses he would want to use.
I've always felt that the image communicates faster than the words, and words are at their best when they come as explanation or development of images.
He believed that our ability to communicate with each other predated the development of language. He would hark back to that kind of instinct or impulse to communicate in verbal images, and felt very strongly, and rightly so. Aside from movies in which people deliberately write lines that are to be remembered, most people remember images from movies much more than the lines, and he knew that and he felt it. And if you look at his films, which I now do in class, and even shut off the dialogue, shut off the sound, and ask the students to tell me what happened, I mean, they can come really close, if not hit it right on the nose.
The bread that the movie was built on, the kind of starch which held it together, was a series of images, that the thing, in a way, should not work for blind people. It's like, it's a false medium, if it's a visual medium that somehow works just fine when you're not paying attention with your eyes.
Baby, 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 baby. Baby, baby.
Baby, 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 baby. You try, Mandy. Come on here. Feel the vibration. You try it. No, dear, you're not feeling it. Again. That's it, man. Feel it. Now, again. That's it, man. Feel your voice. Got it. Keep it going. That's right. That's right. Come on. Now you've got it. That's right. Keep it going. Now. Come on. Nina, show me what you've written.
My contention is that the language of the cinema really developed in the first 20 years of the history of cinema, which was the silent era, before there was dialogue. And I still believe that the language of cinema is non-verbal, or you might even say pre-verbal. The slogan is that D.W. Griffiths was the first to say it, that the camera can photograph thought. And the photographing of thought is in two different ways. Firstly, in a close-up, what the camera can do, it can photograph things unspoken, things that are behind the eyes, so that you see what is not said, you see what is felt and expressed only in the tiny little, movements of face and eyes. So the camera can photograph the things unsaid. The other thing, of course, is that by the language of editing and intercutting and screen sizes and so on, the camera can photograph another kind of thought, the director's thought about the material, about the characters. So in both cases here, dialogue is of secondary importance. I think dialogue is extremely interesting and very valuable, but I think it's rather absolutely fatal if you're working in cinema as distinct from theatre, and here I have to say also as distinct from
television. If you're working in cinema, the story should be told and make itself clear in the mute behavior and in the language of cinema without words. And the paradox is that when you do that, if you then replace the words sound much better. Because if the story is told in the language, in film grammar, in the language of the movies, the language which was developed in the silent era, then it is 80 to 90% clear if you turn off the sound entirely. Then the dialogue, and particularly the inflections in the dialogue, the vocal quality of the dialogue, adds a whole new dimension, but it adds to something that is already there. So on the whole, people who start in terms of writing often the inexperienced writer tends to be much too wordy and much too reliant on dialogue.
Good screenwriting is not essentially a verbal undertaking. It's like good playwriting in that it is reductive. What you're trying to capture in the dialogue is the residue of a state of total consciousness. You're taking the essence of the story and the beingness of the characters and boiling it down and boiling it down and boiling it down into the littlest amount of words that you can manage.
He emphasized nonverbal language aspects of cinema, the necessity to show emotion through action rather than through dialogue. The action spoke louder than words, and he always emphasized that, and he would constantly find examples to illustrate that.
The movie started as images that tell stories without words. The original title cards in the silent days are very interesting. If you look at at its best, the great ones, the chaplains and whatnot, managed to make entire films without a single title card, or with 2 or 3 in the entire card. And the few occasions, incidentally, I'm talking about the end of, say, modern times, the few occasions in which Chaplin uses title cards, the image is already clear without them, but he uses the title card as a sort of punctuation, which is how I think dialogue should be used. My claim is that if you take, for example, Ladykillers, if I run it here, what I do is I say, run it with sound off. 20 minutes, 10%. That's it. It's all there. It's all a cartoon, animated cartoon. So the story should tell itself in pictures of action and reaction. And the dialogue is very valuable, because it's very funny dialogue by Bill Rose, but it's dialogue which is an extension of what is already obvious in the image. The silent movie makers were trained to tell stories without words. It's only when you get down to the latter, to the end, just like in Karl Dreyer's Passion Joan of Arc, there's title card after title card after title card, and what you feel is somebody longing to hear speak.
O feminine Sexe,
The craft of storytelling through images was already well established by the end of the 20th, and very little has been added since then.
It wasn't just build your films on images or build your films silently, but it was tell a story that could only be told in images. And then on top of that, Sandy's own work gave us these lessons. To use, for instance, Sweet Smell of Success, it's no less a visual film than the Ladykillers, while the dialogue's flying at you. What Sandy was teaching me there was that sometimes a page of text can be just thrown away and you end up with a silent film all over again. Meaning it's a silent film with ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba going on top of it. While it was a film filled with dialogue, brimming with dialogue, rapid-fire dialogue, it was effectively completely decipherable as a silent film. And that most of what was being said was kind of details of exposition that you didn't really need to know. And I think a lot of people, it sails right over their heads as they watch the film anyway. And a jazz. It's almost, the words are a kind of jazz, like beautiful cinematography. I memean, they're kind of an enhancement or an added color, but the thing really does dance and sing and tell a story on a pre-verbal level first. It really does. Even such a verbal film, like a building, like a piece of architecture, what is the thing standing on? I don't think the thing's standing on snappy dialogue. I think it may be the walls are covered with it. I believe the floors may be soft with it. I think the elevators may be shimmering with it, but that the girders that the thing is standing on are effectively a kind of journey into darkness with this one character. I mean, effectively the easiest way to relay it is go that first night, following him all the way to his kind of elaborate dance, getting to J.J. Hunsaker and the 21 Club, first trying to get to him through the door, then moving into the operator's room and calling him from a phone, and then finally marching himself right into the dining area, is a very, very visual journey. He tells us where we're arriving, he takes us through this journey, he sets up the characters, you know who's bad and who's good and who's threatening and who's not, and you know who's dancing and is nervous, all visually.
If you look at the opening of Sweet Smell of Success, in terms of dramatizing the backstory, the film opens with the shots of the trucks with Hunsaker's picture on the side of the trucks. We don't know who it is yet, but we know something about it. Newspaper is thrown down on the sidewalk. The guy selling the newspapers knows his name. So this tells us that this is not a one-time occurrence, that this is a kind of a pattern. It's been going on long enough that the guy selling the papers knows him, knows what he wants. He goes back inside, muscles his way through the crowd to the counter. No one says anything. He has in his hand a hot dog, but he has a hot dog with a bite missing from it. So he's been there a while. He's been eating. He's been waiting. He looks, doesn't find what he's looking for, throws it into the trash, and he goes to his office. When he goes to his office, what you see is something in paper taped on the door, I believe is the name of his business. You go inside, you see his secretary. When he goes into the bedroom, she comes in very easily and sits on the bed, which tells us she's been in that room many times before. So you learn of their relationship without his having to say a word about it. And throughout that scene, the fact that he changes clothes there, he lives there, so you learn this is a guy who lives in his own office. He probably is having sex with his secretary. He's upset about something. He was looking for something. We know who Hunsaker is. And all of the information is there without a word of exposition, simply finding the props and the actions or the events that will dramatize the backstory.
What I'm talking about is understanding how in space you can position actors against the camera so that how they move and how they exist explains their relationship. I mean, Sandy will always say that it's about relationships or ultimately about conflict. Well, if you are describing conflict in character relationship to camera and space, then without saying a word, you are communicating relationship. And that's what he ground into me. When I choose a location, that's what I'm thinking about. I judge a location based on the possibilities of getting a camera in a position where it can consume actors in the space. What are the axes that have to work camera, characters, space juxtapositions to say story absolutely silently, and how do you build those into the set? You have physical tools, you have props, you have pieces of furniture, you have pieces of architecture, and where the characters are going to fit in between those things can tell your story, if you set it up right. Having come from an architectural background, I was fascinated by the way Sandy saw story revealing itself in architecture, within space.
The barroom scene on the waterfront, he found it a remarkable scene of film grammar, camera placement, screen size, and the other element that he talked about, use of the triangle, and that every character is pulled in at least two directions. So the camera coverage, the placement of the camera becomes, how do you show on camera that conflict? Sandy would always say, in every scene, you have at least two forces pulling on the character. Characters conflicted in two directions. And the representation, either the physical presence of those forces or something which represents those forces, ought to be present in the scene, so you could see the ways in which the character was drawn.
There's some pretty rough fellas in the way. They give me this to remember them by.
You need to make the decision at any moment at what you are covering. Are you covering the space between people and the way that space changes? Are you covering two people and where danger is coming from? But it's always in terms of the triangle. Sandy's drawings of camera locations would have all these little, camera setups and vectors. You would see the triangle of conflict. In that scene, it's Johnny Friendly, Charlie the Gent, and Terry Malloy. They're placed at that pool table in the three-character triangle. All the camera coverage is about that. Every shot in that scene, in that bar, is incredibly expository. You learn who Johnny Friendly is, who everybody is, what the conflicts, what the tensions are. The first shot shows somebody running into the scene saying, "Hey, boss," and they go to Johnny Friendly, so we know the boss. Throughout the course of the scene, we see all the forces that are going to compete for the rest of the story, the rest of the film. We see Johnny Friendly's cruelty.
Damn me.
We see his kindness. We see him manipulating people. We see the division of the gang.
He has business.
Having trouble with Kelly again, boss. He won't take no loans, and Big Mac puts him to work anyway.
He's my wife's nephew.
But he won't take no loans.
I gotta put him to work. She'd murder me.
We learn of the attitude they have towards Terry.
What mine? Shut up. I like the kid.
So he felt it was just a masterfully constructed scene in terms of handling exposition through a sequence of dramatic events, rather than having somebody simply sit and give us the expository material.
We examined Dr. Strangelove. The scene with Peter Sellers on the phone to the Russian premier is played only on one side. We never cut to the Russian premier on the phone. It's played as a monologue. And Sandy would stop the projector and point out, watch how much of this scene, this long monologue, is played in two-shot, as opposed to a close-up of Sellers on the phone. Sellers is in the foreground on the telephone, and behind him is Peter Bull glaring at him and not moving a muscle. That visual tension is within the same frame there. In fact, Peter Bull kind of is a stand-in for the Russian premier we never see, but it gives you that visual tension and makes the comedy play much funnier than if it had just been a tight shot of Peter Sellers.
Sandy beat into me a mentality of always looking for the spatial representation of story. I'm quite sure that the foundation of my employment as a production designer has been this feeling that everybody can understand that the actors have to relate to each other. And the better people are thinking about how the actors are going to relate to each other in relationship to the camera. But the real masters are thinking about how the actors are going to relate to each other and the camera in space. And the reason that counts is because when you have those things in register, then you're using all possible tools, all possible visual tools to tell the story are at work. And he did that in his films. He drove us through these exercises of silent cinema, and he pointed to the sort of historical precedent for this, all sort of leading to the same thing, maximizing visual language to tell story.
The writer is somebody who sets on paper a description of the visible action. The writer has to be able to conceive things, not in terms of things said or things written on the page, but of a description of an image of action-reaction. That's what screenwriting is. And what's happening again and again here is that people are busy writing dialogue.
So Sandy was actually constantly on us about silent film. We were studying silent film in depth. He had the storyboards that he'd done of Charlie Chaplin's City Lights, particularly the ending, just to show nonverbal cinema.
Using the full range of tools in the toolbox was so important to Sandy that I think he devised his teaching to locate the tools which students tend to rely on too much and take them away. So students would tend, for the purposes of exposition, for the purposes of setting up conflict and character, they would rely too much on dialogue or voiceover narration. So he would take away that tool to force us to rely on the other tools that are equally effective. He wasn't advocating throwing the tools away, but he was advocating exercising the absence of certain tools to understand the full range of tools.
I remember an assignment where we were given title cards. If there's no dialogue allowed except one title card where you can express a line of dialogue as if it were a silent film, what is the title card? Where does it go? What does it say? And obviously, if people are reading it, it can't be that long. So essentially, you're given one sentence, and everything else is a silent film.
He did a version of Streetcar Named Desire, in which he took Tennessee Williams' dialogue and showed how you could actually render it as a silent film with less than 50 words of title cards. You know, thousands of words of Tennessee Williams' lush text would be reduced to 50 words of title cards.
One of our games that we play here is to take a scene from, say, a Tennessee Williams play. One of the first exercises I give them here is a scene from Streetcar, of which is, I think, about 5 or 6 pages. And I say, all right, supposing you were D.W. Griffiths, we'll give you 5 title cards of 8 words each. And I'll play the scene as a silent movie.
What is this article? That's a solid gold dress, I believe. Oh, honest. And this one here. And what is that, fox piece? That's genuine fur fox, a half a mile long. Where are your fox pieces? This is bushy Snow White ones, no less. Where are
It
you?
plays because of Williams' extraordinary ability, Williams as a theatre writer, to think in terms of props, stuff that the actor can use. And he has done it so that it's terribly easy to replace, I think, about 4 pages full of dialogue, excellent dialogue, to cut it all out and leave it as 4 or 5 captions of 3 or 4 words each. And the fascinating thing is that when you do and stage it like that, and shoot it like that with those props, you then bring back the dialogue, and the dialogue is suddenly terrific. But it's terrific because the movie shows and then tells. If you have a thing that's conceived very much in dialogue terms, and then if you throw it away and start again conceiving it visually, when you bring back the dialogue is much better. Because the dialogue is already working on a basis of cinematic narrative. And the dialogue seems better and moves better and is clearer, because it then performs an additional function and not simply the function of exposition.
He was making the point that these are the more traditional ways to do it, this is the most coherent way to do it. He would also at the end of the exercise say that Streetcar Named Desire, shot by Elia Kazan with all the dialogue, is still better than a silent movie of Streetcar, which might be a better movie technically. As utilizing the medium as film. A silent version of Streetcar is more cinematic. Is it a better movie? No.
Marlon Brando goes to see Carl Malden, who's the priest, to say, I love this girl, but my conscience is driving me crazy. I set up her brother being killed, and he goes, there's Edie right now. You tell her. You tell her the truth. If you want to clear your conscience, you go tell her the truth. And Brando walks down this hillside and proceeds to tell Edie what happened. Right at the time that they're talking, the ships are blowing horns and there's construction and you cannot hear a word that he's saying to her. And she's getting hysterical and it's in these close-ups and he's going, I swear to like that he's talking like this and you can't hear him. It's one of these great scenes where you don't have to hear the dialogue.
When I was a executive at Paramount, we made a picture called Witness. It had an ending chock-a-block full of dialogue. The director, a very gifted young man who was making his first American picture, Peter Weir, 2 weeks before shooting, sent a new script, and there was no dialogue in the last 10 pages of the movie. And I said, this is a script, where's the dialogue? And I went down to Lancaster County in Pennsylvania where we were prepping and shooting. And I said, this is insane. You know, where's the dialogue? We've got to go and shoot the way the script was greenlit. And he then took me into his trailer and he showed me the storyboards, much as Sandy would do the storyboards. And he said, this is why I don't need to shoot it 2 ways. And I beg you not to shoot it 2 ways because we have a very, very tight schedule. And through the storytelling of imagery, the turning of a head, the moving away from a landscape of 2 people parting, he was absolutely right. You didn't need all the Hollywood dialogue in order to be able to convey 2 people who wanted to be together, but because of circumstances couldn't be together.
Generally, we find making the scenes that you have an obligation to make a first rendering or realization of not only what has been shot by the director for the pages of the script, and to realize that once. And of course, with new technology, you can show that and say, well, that's the 2 pages. The wonderful thing now is that very quickly, and often, even when the film is being shot, I may have already thought, this will play a lot better if I can get to that point faster. I don't need to say that because I'm doing that either somewhere else in the film, or I just need to leap over that idea because the values change on the way from the page to the screen. You can just feel it. It wants to go this way. It wants to go. Generally, 9 times out of 10, it does want to go faster, and the ideas are communicated much more swiftly than the page would indicate. So taking dialogue out and having a look, which of course by its nature takes a fraction of the time, 9 times out of 10 is a good thing. So with the new technology, you can already make an alternative version. Say, look, well, here's the draft of the pages, but actually the scene as I think it wants to sit at that point in the movie is going to want to do this. And I happen to have in my top pocket something I did earlier, and there it is. And you will demonstrate a cut or a series of juxtapositions which make the point of the scene much more focused. You're always seeking to advance the story, and it is often that the advancing of the images or the action.
He always said, rewrite, rewrite, rewrite. When you get into the editing room, it's the last time you tell the story, and it's a rewrite because now you could rewrite with sound and picture.
The reason why they took me on was that they felt, I think probably correctly, that words were not my strong point, certainly not dialogue. And so I had developed a certain knack for thinking in terms of visual action, and they thought I could bring to this sort of lavish thing a certain sort of pictorial abilities.
I wasn't a very good writer. I had one particular gift which I capitalized on very fast. Because I wasn't terribly good at dialogue, I had to think of methods of making it work visually, and I very quickly got the reputation of being quite brilliant at cutting dialogue, finding a way to tell the story in images rather than in dialogue.
In a student handout, MACKENDRICK describes a situation he found himself in when working as a junior contract writer at Ealing Studios in the late 1940s. The contract writer was often given the task of rewriting screenplays at the behest of the producer or director. MACKENDRICK describes a scene from the script of the 1950 film Dance Hall, which involves a young wife who runs into a former lover in the street. Reminding her that she had left something in his apartment, he takes her back there and makes an attempt to seduce her. The scene was 25 pages long, much to the dismay of the director, who felt it interrupted the flow of the story. When the original scriptwriter was asked to make it shorter, he was able to trim it by only 3 or 4 pages, and the job fell to MACKENDRICK.
It was a difficult period for me because it was one point in which they were deciding whether to renew my contract, and I knew it was up for renewal. I knew this was a sub-test case. And so I said, how short do you want it? And they said, as short as possible. So I was terrified. I went home, and I did what one often does in these things, in that first you read the whole thing through and get the flavor of it here. Then you go back over it, and then you analyze the structural beats in the scene. And I made some notes on that. I woke very early the next morning with a horrendous idea. Jotted down some notes, got dressed, whatnot, went down to the studio, got into my office, and looked at them again and rewrote them rather nervously, and gave them in to be typed. I'll now tell you the way I shot the scene. It is structurally as before. The scene starts in the apartment that we've seen before. Bonner comes up and bursts through the door, carrying the shopping bag that is hers. And as he comes in, he goes straight over to the gramophone, where he puts on a record, so that by the time that Dasha arrives in the doorway, having followed him up, music's playing.
To a dream come true.
Here they are. Remember this?
Yes.
He goes across to the drinks table, and he makes a drink for her. Again, he doesn't ask her if she wants a drink. He makes the drink that, they've had before. Brings it over to her while she's listening to the song. And as she's looking out, he, behind her, stoops over and kisses her on the back of the neck.
Something for you, but I don't. Might never have happened.
What are you getting at?
You know what I'm getting at. You were going to make a pass at me because you can't help making passes at people. And it didn't mean a thing. Oh, Alec, I'm so glad it's Phil and not you.
Lady, how you flatter me.
Well, you're a sport, Alec.
So are you. That goes double. I must have been a fool to let you go.
It was the best thing you ever did, for both of us. Well, after all that, I better be going. Goodbye. It's funny, isn't it?
What's interesting is that every move in the scene is an acting script, because all the beats are there, but it has just been reduced to things that don't need to be said.
One of the famous cards on the wall said, and it's easy to forget what it said because we misremember it, it actually said, movies should show, then tell. It's easy to remember that or misremember it as movies should show, not tell. Of course, there is this example of the Streetcar Named Desire exercise where he's discovering in the greatness of Tennessee Williams' writing that the author has already provided a lot of physical elements which even a good stage director ought to be picking up on. One benefit, I think, of following this method of looking at a story and saying, first of all, how am I going to show this? And then I'll worry about the telling, the talking part of it, is that it's going to give you all kinds of useful artifacts for directing the actors. Because it's going to physicalize the action, it's going to give them objects which are reading immediately to the audience and allow the actor to express the scene.
By thinking of things in terms of, movies show and then tell, or, these kind of very basic aphorisms that he would throw at us, one of the things that I've always thought about since then is, why is this a movie? And it's one of the things Sandy, I think, would rant about. I'm not sure that it's contained in any of his handouts, but the kind of, this is the way I've evolved in coining it. I don't think Sandy put it this way, but that there's kind of filmed plays and then there's movies, you know, and that Sandy was interested in movies. And movies somehow could only have been a film. They couldn't have been a play or a novel or anything else. A cinematic challenge that is uniquely cinematic.
Very nice.
I like the ones of you making pizza.
I don't know about that.
You got something on your chin.
In a context and an era when I made Heavy, that was literally coming out on the heels of movies like Pulp Fiction. It was the most kind of verbal, tongue-in-cheek, aggressive, high-octane rock and roll moment in independent filmmaking. And in a way, what I was doing was running completely counter to it. And I don't begin to think that the kind of conservative streak that I have in me wasn't in part shaped by Sandy. He represented and tried to teach us how to make films that were very entertaining, but also was not susceptible to fashion in some way. And also just prescribed to us, you know, like it's like, what were you after? What are you trying to make here? What part of movie making are you playing with?
I can't think of anything more stultifying in cinema than to have a character introduce himself in the first 5 minutes of the film and tell you his life story. I mean, I think we'd all head for the exits. You know, successful cinema introduces us to a character in action, doing something, and through that action and the way the character interacts with his environment, with the world he's in, and with the things around him, from the smallest nuances of costuming to his shoes to everything else, tell us boatloads about this character that are important for the story.
Sandy would talk about exposition is boring, and the shorthand for boring exposition was Highland cattle. And I guess they used to like say this to each other at Ealing Studios when somebody would come up with some bonehead exposition line. And yeah, it's like a guy on a train going up through northern England would point out the window and go, "Oh, look, Highland cattle." I mean, it's like the most bald exposition in the world. There's no finesse about it at all. Sandy would say, you know, don't say something, show it.
He always talked about dramatizing, which leads to this notion of physicalizing. Everything had to be physicalized. That nothing remained talked about or passive. You should be able to know what is going on without hearing anything. That the actions should tell the story. That you should be able to tell a story without people talking.
He was talking about the relationship between Burt Lancaster and Tony Curtis in Sweet Smell of Success. And when they're walking down the street, if you look, he makes Burt walk straight down the street, very kind of heavily, and Tony like a little fly buzzing round him, so that you get their relationship actually in their actions in relationship to each other.
Nowadays, that would all be done in cuts, and not nearly as effective as just seeing it all at once and letting the audience kind of cut between, do I want to look at what Burt Lancaster is doing or Tony Curtis is doing? You watch a lot of contemporary movies these days, and staging for the camera or getting that density of information within a single frame and how to stage a master shot is becoming rare. It's almost a lost art. I've worked on films where I'll get a master shot that is basically static, and there would be, say, 5 principal characters in the scene and 5 pages of dialogue. And so the shot starts, and the actors walk to their marks, and they stand there for 5 minutes. Extremely boring, and not much an editor can do with that, except start on the master shot, establish where everybody is in the room, and then start going into coverage.
We reveal a lot by what we don't say. Speech is only one form of behavior. That you can tell a story really well without using words, and that the words that you speak might not even be the most important part of your behavior. When I work with some of my actors at first, I ask them to try and get what they want non-verbally, so that they have to really find within themselves what the movement, the action is in their bodies because it starts there. It starts in body. Speech is just kind of the skin of what it is you want. It's the meat of it is in the behavior that speech is kind of the ultimate representation of.
I take a baseball bat, break it over his head.
Hey, Joe.
I admire the work of Marty Ritt very much when he's working with actors. Marty Ritt had to deal with Richard Burton in a film called The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. And Burton, I don't know whether Burton really wanted to do it, and perhaps Burton was imposed on him. But Marty and Burton didn't get on at all well. I think my sympathies, I mean, Burton is a very great actor, but at a certain stage in his career, as people have said recently, you know, he really began to despise himself in the profession. And so he started to fall back on theatrical, rather than cinematic, theatrical tricks. He's this fabulous Welsh dark brown voice. And so he used intonations like that, and the performance was absolutely phony. Marty simply controlled him by refusing to let Burton raise his voice at all, by insisting on the kind of reasons that he had to speak very quietly. Well, when you're speaking like that, Burton couldn't use this great cello voice here, and he was forced, he hated it. But what was produced was an intensity of believability such as doesn't appear in a lot of Burton's films. It's a marvelous performance.
Switch off the voice. What else do we hear? What else do we see the body doing? Let's find a way of expressing this man's defeat without words.
Props for Sandy had so much to do with the visual storytelling and ways to not have to use dialogue to explain. Props can do a number of things. They can create mystery for the viewer. They can explain the nature of a character. I think a lot of where Sandy got his prop ideas was working with Alec Guinness. I mean, Alec Guinness was the actor who first said, when I figure out how this character walks, I figure out who the character is. What he meant by that is, you know, Alec Guinness would spend a long time figuring out what shoes, what pants, what props that character would use and wear, and thereby penetrate something about the character.
Alec Guinness is without doubt the most inventive film actor I ever worked with. Extraordinary with props, with walks, with looks, with either his own costume or anybody else's. Very sensitive to locations, to the atmosphere of places. He'd see the possibilities of this or that or the other. He was forever trying to readjust the pictures so that they didn't fall sideways like that.
I only
I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have.
He was rather good with his scarf, I remember. This enormous grey woolly scarf, and it was just far, far too long. I mean, far longer than a scarf should be, so it was getting caught. And he would wrap it round himself. And I'm sure Sandy must have learned a vast amount from Alec.
One of the things that's absolutely a joy, as I think I've said before, is to watch Alec exploring a set for business and finding props in the set. Because he is a great gimmickry actor. The first 2 days of Alec's performances are usually disastrous, because there he's brought all of his cleverest ideas, and you see him as clever as a cage of monkeys, and you don't believe a word of it. But what happens is that as he develops, he will then discard the things that don't work and find roots in what does work, and the performance will sort of silt down. And he does this thing which is process, in which he explores. And one of his things is explore the feeling of objects. And he will find things on the set that he likes to play with. For these moments here, if you're at all intelligent, what you do is you sit there and stand back and just give him his time and see what he finds. Because he finds jewels.
You don't have to be afraid of me. I'm not going to bite you.
On the waterfront, and there's stories about it, whether they're true or apocryphal, that it was an accident, that Eva Marie Saint inadvertently dropped the glove and Brando picked it up. Others say no, it was planned. But the thing about the use of that prop, which was so critical and so beautiful in terms of story, again, and in terms of the conflict, it represented the conflict in the best way. It was her glove, he put it on his hand. She wanted to leave, but she could not leave until he returned the glove to her. In that case, the prop, however it came about, is irrelevant, as you know. It doesn't matter whose idea it was. It was just a perfect device for intensifying the story. It reveals so much about the inner world of that man, the softness of this glove on that rough hand. That's the way a good prop works.
The key thing, oddly enough, is props. There's an old comic statement called the sweeping the floor routine, which is based on some anecdote of a director working on a case in which somebody had to dash into a bar and say, you know, where's my sister? And the sister is in the back room or something like that. And there's a dramatic situation. Well, the small part actor could not get the dramatic tone out of his voice to say she's in the back room, you know. The director was at the end of his tether. So finally he realized the right thing to do was that he threw some dirt on the floor and gave the actor a broom and said, I want that stuff swept over and put in a pile just there. You know, nothing here. Do that while you say the line. And the actor had to concentrate on sweeping the floor, and the line came out naturally. Well, the devices of giving actors business or incidental activity to preoccupy them so that their thoughts are, shall I say, are an impulse that is a distraction from a piece of senseless business. This almost always produces more natural behavior in the experienced actor, inexperienced actor. The experienced actor, of course, will discover that sort of material for himself or herself. But the need to devise props, literally props, that is, objects to behave with, is one of the director's main functions, because what you're doing is you're trying to give the actor behavior in front of the camera which reveals character.
What you direct is the audience's attention. And in addition to the obvious uses or not so obvious uses of camera placement and film grammar is the use of props. And he would always talk about the what did he call it? The broom scene, which every director or acting teacher knows. If an actor is having a difficult time with the piece of material, you give them a physical task, and it would help them. Well, the reason was very clear, because they would stop doing the task when something was important. And Sandy knew that, and he thought, if the characters have things in their hand, like a sandwich, like a kitten at the beginning of The Godfather, like the glove and On the Waterfront when Terry Malloy puts on Edie Doyle's glove. They will do this because they have some. He had to, you have to eat the lunch. You're playing with the cat. You stop that when you have something to say. And it's another way of providing emphasis, of separating one particular line or look from all the rest of it.
I'm always finding in scenes that when something's come run aground and feels horribly flat, it's a tennis match, and there just is nothing else going on. And that essentially what looked good on a page because it read well is dying on screen because there's just no dimension to it. And that, I mean, I found myself when I was shooting Copland with a scene with both Bob De Niro and Sly Stallone where, and I think it's one of the better scenes in the movie, where Stallone comes in to kind of enlist De Niro and say, I'm ready to help you bust these guys in my town. And I'm sitting there rehearsing the scene and it was terrible. And I wrote it. And I'm with two pretty renowned actors. And I've got no good reason. It's terrible. And I kept the two actors through lunch to try and solve this. And De Niro ordered a sandwich. And I did the scene again while he was eating, just to hear it. I said, just read it again. Just do it again. I'm going to listen. I'm just trying to listen. And I had no idea. But the whole, even looking down at the floor, the whole dynamic of the scene had changed when Bob had the sandwich. Because he played the sandwich.
Look, I'm sorry it took so long for me to come around. But you were right. I couldn't see the truth. Like you said, the evidence, my loyalties, they were confused.
They never give you any napkins in this place. What am I supposed to use? You want this?
What is this? You came to me, to my town, with all these speeches, and you were talking to me about doing the right thing, and I'm doing the right thing. What's going on? What are you doing?
That was like 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago?
He was uninvolved in Stallone's character coming in the room and was completely involved in making his turkey sandwich and taking off too much mayo they had put on it. And suddenly the scene had dynamism, huge dynamism. And it was simply because someone had something else to do. And not just fiddle with something, but an agenda. An agenda which was, I'm hungry. And actually this sandwich means more to me than you.
The ideal director would direct by inadvertence, either by giving and withholding the warmth and the spotlight of their attention, or by laying traps in which an ordinary intelligent person, particularly that character, would be drawn to. A little girl, a little doll, or whatever, so that you could perform more of a mise en scène in the sense of staging for the camera instead of a montage, and force people to come where you needed them to come without saying take 2 steps to your right, hit your mark, find your light, that sort of thing, which works very well with a professional actor if you're lucky enough to have one. But much better, and I totally agree with him on this, is if the little girl comes out and sees the doll and goes and looks at the doll, and to see the doll she has to be standing right where you want her. You know, it doesn't have to be a doll, it can be a pack of cigarettes, it can be keys, a certain book, whatever it is that is likely to draw the actor's attention and ours in a logical fashion and pull them into the geometry that is necessary to explain the story point.
He did an exercise with us, and we all had to place the camera where we thought we could stage the actors, the action, you always say, to the vector of the lens. And I never really knew what it meant, but it kind of meant if you were in a room, you place your camera where you get the I suppose the longest depth of field, where you get a window and a door and so on, and that you would stage your action so that when emotionally you wanted to be closer to an actor, you could just place a prop like an ashtray and they would lean forward and they would just quite naturally be bigger in frame than they were before. He'd say, as a director, go on your set the night before, walk through the scene, try and work out how emotionally close you'd need to be to your actors. He said, and then place your props so that naturally they will be in a place just to pick up their prop when you want them to be there. And he was a great believer in doing that the night before and the morning before, being on your set, thinking where you want to put your camera. And he'd say quite brutally to students, he'd say, you don't know where to put the camera. Or he'd say to a student, I don't think so-and-so knows where to put his camera.
This process of the director exploring the environment before the actors come on the set is very important because it allows him to decide, this is how I'd like to shoot it, this is how I'd like them to execute and to use the props and set pieces. Let me preset it that way, but act like it was just that way when I found it. I came in today and I asked for these chairs here and they just happened to put them that way. I don't even draw attention to it. In the majority of times, the actors will look at it and go, aha.
A director very often, I speak for myself,
who come on the floor with a hesitant and sort of manner of, I'm not sure how I should do that, and what would I do? Would you like to stand here? Would you like to hear? Very uncertain, when I know precisely where I want the actor to stand. And I've placed props that he will discover there. So I will play tentativeness here in order to lead the actor on the lightest of strings to discover what I have already discovered here.
Key to the idea of the director's relationship with the actor is also the word manipulation. It's understanding too, manipulation, we use it in a pejorative way, but it is not. I mean, mani is coming from hand, I think. We manipulate food into our mouth. That is not a bad thing. A director manipulates the actors, not in a negative way, but in a very positive way, to get them to do what he wants. Hopefully the director is open-minded enough to change what he wants if the actor knows something better for him to do. But this idea which Sandy would have that coming on the sound stage, it would be very important for the director to know how he would like the scene played, but he understands too, just as with students and with children, if you come in and say, now eat your food this way, the kid is going to do everything except eat his food that way. And I think Sandy understood that if that child, or if the student, or if the actor could discover these things for themselves, it would be a much richer performance.
When he was doing the Ladykillers, the room that all the assembled hooligans were meeting in to plot their schemes, he had built so that there were no right angles in the room, the floor slightly sloped. He said that he left various props around for the actors to discover. And the thing that impressed me about that, and the reason I tell it to my students, is because what you don't want to do is tell your actor what to do. But you do want to get a desired result, and the way to do that is to prepare the scene in such a way that they'll discover what it is you want to have happen, and then, brilliantly will come up with it, and you'll applaud and, secretly smile, I got it.